Before we jump to the conclusion that the Romans were less creative or capable than we are, let us remind ourselves that innovations and inventions to which we have grown accustomed to often seem so obvious to us that we wonder why our predecessors did not introduce them earlier. Most of us readily take things for granted that at an earlier time remained to be discovered. So, too, later generations may wonder how we could have overlooked certain innovations that they will take for granted. Because of what we take for granted, might not we, like the Romans, be insufficiently creative in reshaping our political institutions? Although the Roman Republic endured considerably longer than the Athenian democracy, and longer than any modern democracy has yet endured, it was undermined after about 130 BCE by civil unrest, war, militarization, corruption, and a decline in the sturdy civic spirit that had previously existed among its citizens. What little remained of authentic republican practices perished with the dictatorship of Julius Caesar. After his assassination in 44 BCE, a republic once governed by its citizens became an empire ruled by its emperors. With the fall of the republic, popular rule entirely disappeared in southern Europe, except for the political systems of small, scattered tribes vanished from the face of the earth for nearly 1,000 years. Italy, like an extinct species re-emerging after a massive climate change, popular rule began to reappear in many of the cities of northern Italy around 1100 CE. Once again, it is in relatively small city-states that popular governments developed, not in large regions or countries. In a pattern familiar in Rome and later repeated during the emergence of modern representative governments, participation in the governing bodies of the city-states was at first restricted to members of upper-class families, nobles, large landowners, and the like. But in time, urban residents, who were lower in the socio-economic scale, began to demand the right to participate. Members of what we today would call the middle classes, the newly rich, the smaller merchants and bankers, the skilled craftsmen, organized in guilds, the foot soldiers commanded by the knights, were not only more numerous than the dominant upper classes, but also capable of organizing themselves. What is more, they could threaten violent uprisings, and if need be, carry them out. As a result, in many cities, people like these, the popolo, as they were sometimes called, gained the right to participate in the government of the city. For 2 centuries and more, these republics flourished in a number of Italian cities. A good many republics were, like Florence and Venice, centers of extraordinary prosperity, exquisite craftsmanship, superb art and architecture, unexcelled urban design, magnificent poetry and music, and enthusiastic rediscovery of the ancient world of Greece and Rome. What later generations were to call the Middle Ages came to a close, and that incredible outburst of brilliant creativity, the Renaissance, arrived. Unhappily for the development of democracy, however, after about the mid-1300s, the republican governments of some of the major cities increasingly gave way to perennial enemies of popular government. Economic decline, corruption, oligarchy, war, conquest, and seizure of power by authoritarian rulers, whether princes, or monarchs, or soldiers. Nor was that all. Viewed in the longer sweep of historical trends, the city-state was doomed as a foundation for popular government by the emergence of a rival with overwhelming superior forces, the national state or country. Towns and cities were designed destined, in fact, to be incorporated into this larger and more powerful entity, thus becoming, at most, subordinate units of government. Glorious as they had been, the city-state was obsolete. Words about words. You may have noticed that I have referred to popular governments in Greece, Rome, and Italy. To designate their popular governments, the Greeks, as we saw, invented the term democracy. The Romans drew on their native Latin and called their government a republic. And later the Italians gave that name to the popular governments of some of their city-states. You might well wonder whether democracy and republic refer to fundamentally different types of constitutional systems, or instead do the two words just reflect differences in the languages from which they originally came. The correct answer was obfuscated by James Madison in 1787. In an influential paper he wrote to win support for newly proposed American Constitution, one of the principal architects of that Constitution and a statesman of exceptionally well informed in political science of his time, Madison distinguished between a pure democracy, by which I mean a society consisting of a small number of citizens who assemble and administer the government in person, and a republic, by which I mean a government in which the scheme of representation takes place. This distinction had no basis in prior history. Neither in Rome, nor in, for example, in Venice, was there a scheme of representation. Indeed, the earlier republics all pretty much fit into Madison's definition of a democracy. What is more, the two terms were used interchangeably in the United States during the 18th century, nor is Madison's distinction found in a work by the well-known French political philosopher Montesquieu, whom Madison greatly admired and frequently praised. Madison himself would have known that this proposed distinction had no firm historical basis, and so we must conclude that he made it to discredit critics who contended that the proposed constitution was not sufficiently democratic. However that may be, the matter is unclear. The plain fact is that the words democracy and republic did not, despite Madison, designate differences in types of popular government. What they reflected, at the cost of later confusion, was a difference between Greek and Latin, the languages from which they came. Northern Europe, whether called democracies or republics, the system of popular government in Greece, Rome, and Italy all lacked several crucial characteristics of a modern representative government. Classical Greece, as well as medieval and Renaissance Italy, were composed of popular local governments, but lacked an effective national government. Rome had, so to speak, just one local government based on popular participation, but no national parliament of elected representatives. From today's perspective, conspicuously absent from all these systems were at least three basic political institutions: a national parliament, composed of elected representatives, and a popular chosen local governments that were ultimately subordinate to the national government. A system of combining democracy at local levels with a popularly elected parliament at the top level had yet to be invented. This combination of political institutions originated in Britain, Scandinavia, the lowlands, Switzerland, and elsewhere north of the Mediterranean. Although the patterns of political development diverged widely among these regions, a highly simplified version would look something like this. In various localities, freemen and nobles would begin to participate directly in local assemblies. To these were added the regional and national assemblies consisting of representatives, some or all of whom would come to be elected. Local assemblies. I begin with the Vikings, not only from sentiment, but also because their experience is little known, though highly relevant. I have sometimes visited the Norwegian farm, about 80 miles northeast of Trondheim, from which my parental paternal grandfather emigrated, and which to my delight is still known as Dahl Vester, or West Dahl, in the nearby town of Skrytra. You can still see a boat-shaped ring of large stones where Viking freemen regularly met from about 600 CE to 1000 CE to hold an adjunctive assembly called, in Norse, a ting. Incidentally, the English word thing is derived from an Old English word meaning both thing and assembly. Similar places, some even older, can be found elsewhere in the vicinity. By 1900 CE, assemblies of free Vikings were meeting not just in Trondheim region, but in many other areas of Scandinavia as well. As in Skida, the ting was typically held in an open field, marked off by large vertical stones. At the meeting of the ting, the freemen settled disputes, discussed, accepted and rejected laws, adopted and turned down a proposed change of religion, as they did when they accepted Christianity in place of the Old Norse religion, and even elected or gave their approval to a king, who was often required to swear his faithfulness to the laws approved by the ting. The Viking knew little or nothing of what would have cared less about the democratic and republican political practices 1,000 years earlier in Greece and Rome, operating from logic and of equality that they applied to free men. They seem to have created assemblies on their own. That the idea of equality was alive and well among Viking freemen in the 10th century is attested to by the answer given by the Danish Vikings when, while travelling up a river in France, they were asked by a messenger calling out from the riverbank, "What is the name of your master?" "None," they replied, "we are all equals." But we must resist the temptation to exaggerate. The equality that Vikings boasted about applied only among free men, and even they varied in wealth and status. Beneath the free men were the slaves, like the Greeks and the Romans, or for that matter Europeans and Americans centuries later. The Vikings possessed slaves, enemies captured in battle, or the hapless victims of raids on neighbouring peoples, or simply persons brought in the ancient and ubiquitous commerce in slaves. And unlike the men free by birth, when slaves were freed, they remained dependent on their previous owners. If slaves were a caste below free men, above them was an aristocracy of families with wealth, usually in land and hereditary status. At the apex stood a king, whose power was limited by his election, his obligation to obey the laws, and his need to retain the loyalty of the nobles and the support of the free men. In spite of these severe limits on equality, the class of free men, free peasants, smallholders, farms, was large enough to impose a lasting democratic influence on political institutions and traditions. In several other parts of Europe, local conditions also sometimes favoured the emergence of popular participation in government. The high mountain valleys of the Alps, for example, provided a measure of protection and autonomy to free men engaged in pastoral activities. As a modern writer describes later the Swiss canton of Granobund, around 800 CE, free peasants found themselves in a uniquely egalitarian situation. Bound together by their common status and by their common rights of usage over mountain pastures, they developed a sense of equality wholly at odds with the hierarchical status consensus thrust of medieval feudalism. This distinctive spirit was to dominate the later emergence of democracy in the Rhetor Republic. From assemblies to parliaments, when the Vikings ventured westward to Iceland, they transplanted their political practices and in several localities recreated a ting. But they did more, foreshadowing the later appearance of national parliaments. Elsewhere in 1930 CE, they created a sort of suprating, a althing, or national assembly, which remained the source of Icelandic law for 3 centuries, until the Icelanders were finally subjugated by Norway. Meanwhile, in Norway, Denmark, and Sweden, regional assemblies developed, and then, as in Iceland, national assemblies. Although the subsequent growth in the power of the king and the centralized bureaucracies under his control reduced the importance of these national assemblies, they left their mark on later developments. In Sweden, for example, the tradition of popular participation in assemblies of the Viking period led to the 5th century to a precursor of a modern representative. Parliaments, when the king began to summon meetings of representatives from different sectors of Swedish society: nobility, clergy, burghers, and common people. These meetings eventually evolved into the Swedish Riksdag, or Parliament. In the radically different environment of the Netherlands and Flanders, the expansion of manufacturing, commerce, and finance helped to create urban middle classes, composed of persons who commanded sizable economic resources. Rulers perpetually starved for revenues could neither ignore this rich load nor tax it without gaining the consent of its owners. To obtain consent, rulers summoned meetings of representatives, drawn from the towns and most important social classes. Although these assemblies, parliaments, or estates, as they were often called, did not evolve directly into national legislatures of today, they established traditions, practices, and ideas that strongly favoured such a development. Meanwhile, from obscure beginnings, a representative parliament was gradually coming into existence, that, in the centuries to come, would exert far and away the greatest influence on the idea and practice of representative government. This was the Parliament of medieval England, a product less in intention and design than of blind evolution. Parliament grew out of assemblies summoned sporadically and under the pressure of need during the reign of Edward I from 1272 to 1307. How Parliament evolved from these beginnings is too lengthy and complex a story to be summarized here. By the 18th century, however, that evolution had led to a constitutional system in which the king and Parliament were each limited by the authority of the other. Within Parliament, the power of the hereditary aristocracy in the House of Lords was offset by the power of the people in the House of Commons, and the laws enacted by King and Parliament were interpreted by judges who were mostly, though by no means always, independent of King and Parliament alike. In the 1700s, this seemingly marvellous system of checks and balances among the country's major social forces and separation of powers within the government was widely admired in Europe. It was lauded by the famous French political philosopher Montesquieu, among others, and admired in America by framers of the Constitution, many of whom hoped to create in America a republic that would retain the virtues of the English system without the vices of a monarchy. The republic they helped to form would, in due time, provide something of a model for many other republics. democratization on the way out, but only on the way. Looking back with all the advantages of hindsight, we can easily see that by the early 18th century, political ideas and practices had appeared in Europe that were to become important elements in later democratic beliefs and institutions. Using language that is more modern and abstract than people of the time would have employed, let me summarize what these elements were. Favored by local conditions and opportunities in several areas of Europe, notably Scandinavia, Flanders, the Netherlands, Switzerland and Britain, the logic of equality stimulated the creation of local assemblies in which freemen could participate in governing, at least to an extent. The idea that governments need consent of the governed, initially a claim primarily about raising taxes, was gradually growing into a claim about laws in general. Over an area too large for primary assemblies of freemen, as in large town, city, region or country, consent required representation in the body that raised taxes and made laws. In sharp contrast to the Athenian practice, representation was to be secured not by lot or random selection, but by election. To secure the consent of free citizens in a country or nation state would require elected representative legislators or parliaments at several levels, local, national and perhaps provincial, regional or other intermediate levels as well. These European political ideas and practices provided a base from which democratization could proceed. Among proponents of further democratization, accounts of popular governments in classical Greece, Rome, and the Italian cities sometimes lent greater plausibility to their advocacy. These historical experiences had demonstrated that governments subject to the will of the people were more than illusory hopes. Once upon a time they had actually existed and had lasted for centuries to boot. What hadn't been achieved if the ideas, traditions, history and practices just described held a promise of democratization, it was at best only a promise. Crucial pieces were still missing. First, even in countries with the most auspicious beginnings, gross inequalities posed enormous obstacles to democracy. Differences between the rights, duties, influence and power of slaves and free men, rich and poor, landed and landless, master and servant, men and women, day labourers and apprentices, skilled craft workers and owners, burghers and bankers, feudal lords and tenants, nobles and commoners, monarchs and their subjects, the king's officials and those they ordered about. Even free men were highly unequal in status, wealth, work, obligations, knowledge, freedom, influence and power. And in many places the wife of a free man was regarded by law, custom and practice as his property. Then, as always and everywhere, the logic of equality ran head-on into the brute facts of inequality. Second, even where assemblies and parliaments existed, they were a long way from meeting minimal democratic standards. Parliaments were often no match for a monarch. It would be centuries before control over the king's ministers would shift from monarch to parliament, or president would take the place of a king. Parliaments themselves were bastions of privilege, particularly in chambers reserved for the aristocracy and higher clergy. Representatives elected by the people had at best only a partial say in lawmaking. Third, the representatives of the people did not really represent the whole people. For one thing, free men were, after all, men. Except for the occasional female monarch, half the adult population was excluded from political life. But so were many adult males. Most adult males, in fact. As late as 1832 in Great Britain, the right to vote extended to only 5% of the population over the age of 20. In that year, it took a tremendous and tempestuous struggle to expand the suffrage to slightly more than 7%. In Norway, the promising appearance of popular participation in the Dings of Viking times, the percentage was a little better. Looking at the percentage, Great Britain's electorate 1831 to 1931, from the Encyclopedia of Britannia published in 1970, under the subheading of Parliament. Percentage of population over the age of 20 who could take part. In 1831 it was 4.4%. In 1832 it was 7.1%. In 1864 it was 9%. In 1868 it was 16.4%. In 1883 it was 18%. In 1886 it was 28.5%. In 1914 it was 13%. In 1921 it was 74%. In 1931 it was 97%. Fourth, until the 18th century and later, democratic ideas and beliefs were not widely shared or even well understood. In all countries, the logic of equality was effective only among a few, and a rather privileged few at that. Even an understanding of what a democratic republic would require in the way of political institutions was all but non-existent. In speech and press freedom of expression was seriously restricted, particularly if it was exercised to criticize the king. Political opposition lacked legitimacy and legality. His Majesty's loyal opposition was an idea whose time had not yet come. Political parties were widely condemned as dangerous and undesirable. Elections were notoriously corrupt by agents of the crown. The advance of democratic ideas and practices depended on the existence of a certain favourable conditions that did not yet exist. As long as only a few believed in democracy and were prepared to fight for it, existing privilege would maintain itself with the aid of undemocratic governments. Even if many more people came to believe in democratic ideas and goals, other conditions would still be required if further democratization were to be achieved. Later on in part 4 I will describe some of the most important of these conditions. Meanwhile, we need to recall that after the promising beginnings sketched out in this chapter, democratization did not proceed on an ascending path to the present. There were ups and downs, resistance, movements, rebellions, civil wars, revolutions. For several centuries, the rise of centralized monarchies reversed some of the earlier advances. Even though, ironically, these very monarchies may have helped to create some conditions that were favorable to democratization in the longer run. Looking back on the rise and the decline of democracy, it is clear that we cannot count on historical forces to ensure that democracy will always advance or even survive. And so long intervals in which popular governments vanished from the earth remind us, democracy, it appears, is a bit chancy. But its chances also depend on what we ourselves do. Even if we cannot count on benign historical forces to favour democracy, we are not mere victims of blind forces over which we have no control. With adequate understanding of what democracy requires and the will to meet its requirements, we can act to preserve and, what is more, to advance democratic ideas and practices.